Hello and welcome to this session on primary and secondary qualities. The primary and secondary quality distinction is a conceptual distinction in epistemology and metaphysics concerning the nature of reality. It's most explicitly articulated by John Locke in his work Essay Concerning Human Understanding, but early thinkers such as Galileo and Descartes made similar distinctions. Primary qualities are thought to be properties of objects that are independent of any observer, such as solidity, extension, motion, number, and figure. These characteristics convey facts. They exist in the thing itself, can be determined with certainty, and do not rely on subjective judgments. For example, if a ball is spherical, no one can reasonably argue that it's triangular. Primary qualities are measurable aspects of physical reality. Secondary qualities are thought to be properties that produce sensation in observers, such as color, taste, smell, and sound. They can be described as the effect things have on certain people. Knowledge that comes from secondary qualities does not provide objective facts about things. Secondary qualities are subjective. Under the unassuming heading, Other considerations concerning symbol ideas, Locke next introduces one of the most important topics in the entire essay, the distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Locke tells us that there is a crucial difference between two kinds of simple ideas we receive from sensation. Some of the ideas we receive resemble their causes out in the world, while others do not. The ideas which resemble their causes are the ideas of primary qualities, like texture, number, size, shape, motion, etc. The ideas which do not resemble their causes are the ideas of secondary qualities, such as color, sound, taste, and odor. Distinction between primary and secondary qualities. The best way to understand the distinction between primary and secondary qualities is in terms of explanation. Whenever you have the sensation of a square book, the cause of that sensation is some sort of shape out in the world, though not necessarily squareness, since there may be some optical illusion, because distance, for instance, forces you to perceive the shape incorrectly. So the explanation for sensation of shape is shape in the external world. Whenever you have a sensation of blue, on the other hand, the cause is not blueness out in the world. The cause is some specific arrangement of the insensible parts of matter. Explanations for secondary qualities refer only to primary qualities. Locke's argument for this claim is based on his estimation of the best science available, which he believes is Boyle's corpuscular hypothesis. According to the best scientific picture we have of the natural world, Locke argues all that is out there are colorless, tasteless, soundless, odorless corpuscles of matter. Using only these indivisible bits of matter and their motions, we can explain not only our sensations of primary qualities, but our sensations of secondary qualities as well. Sensations of color, odor, taste, and sound are caused by the primary qualities of arrangements of matter. Locke refers to these arrangements as powers of objects to cause sensations. Given that we are able to explain everything we need to explain by positing the existence only of primary qualities, he reasons, we have no reason to think that secondary qualities have any real basis in the world. An argument of this form is often called an argument from parsimony and rests on the premise that it is best not to posit the existence of explanatorily superfluous entities. The rest of Locke's discussion of the primary-secondary quality distinction focuses on making the conclusion seem more plausible. He presents a number of thought experiments designed to bring our intuitions into line with his. First, he describes breaking a piece of wheat up into smaller and smaller pieces. He points out that as small as a wheat becomes, we cannot conceive of it without its primary qualities, presumably since the very idea of a body without shape or size is incoherent, whereas we can conceive of the wheat without color, presumably because there is nothing literally incoherent about a body without color, even if it is difficult to imagine one in actuality. He next considers an almond that is being pounded with a pestle. As it gets broken up into smaller and smaller pieces, the color changes from a pure white to a dirtier hue, and the taste becomes from sweet to oily. Yet, all that was altered was the texture of the nut. Clearly, he concludes, the secondary qualities depend on the primary qualities. Finally, he takes the example of a flame. If we put our hand in the flame, we have a sensation of pain. If we look at the flame, we have a sensation of color. No one would claim that pain is in the flame itself, he points out. So why do we suppose that the color is? Analysis. Locke's argument for the claim that secondary qualities do not exist out in the world as we perceive them is obviously not as strong as the science it rests on. He knew that if that science turns out to be false, his entire argument would crumble. One might wonder why he would be willing to risk such an important point on an uncertain theory. At least part of the answer to this question lies in the fact that the entire reason that the distinction between primary and secondary qualities was important to Locke was because of his belief in the new mechanistic science. Locke was intent on giving a philosophical clarification of the distinction specifically because he wanted to clear the way for the new science to take hold. He suspected that a general reluctance to believe in a colorless, odorless, tasteless world would prove to be a major obstacle to the acceptance of theory like Boyle's. He therefore wanted to make this stark view of the world more palatable, at least on a purely intellectual level. On a visceral, emotional level, it would remain hard to stomach even for modern physics students. If the science turns out to be wrong enough to leave his argument unsupported, then he would not have had much interest left in supporting his argument anyway. Turning from the argument to the theory itself, it's difficult to conceive of how the motion of colorless, odorless particles is supposed to cause sensations like blueness and sweetness in us. Given that even today, with science as advanced as it is, we still cannot solve this mystery. It remains one of the most hotly debated problems in both philosophy of mind and in the cognitive sciences. It might seem unfair to hold Locke accountable for leaving us without a satisfactory answer. To his credit, Locke himself recognized the explanatory gap and tried to smooth over it by offering yet another thought experiment. This time, he asks us to consider a knife. When a knife cuts flesh, it causes pain. We cannot imagine what it is about steel that leads to the sensation of pain, but yet no one doubts that it is the steel and not any pain inside the knife that causes the pain in us. Though this thought experiment does not clear up the mystery at all, it shows that even Locke realized the most puzzling consequence of the theory he espoused. In fact, he recognized it so fully that it plays a large role in the theory of knowledge presented in Book 4. Another puzzling aspect of Locke's theory of secondary and primary qualities is the ontological status of secondary qualities. In what sense are these qualities supposed to exist independent of observers? If there were no observers around, would they continue to exist as powers in the objects, or would they simply cease to be? There seems to be a certain ambiguity in the way Locke uses the word powers. Either a power could be an intrinsic property of the object in the world, or else a power could be a relational property that exists between the object and the observer. If Locke means a power to be an intrinsic property of objects, then secondary qualities do have an entirely mind-independent existence, even if they do not exist as we perceive them. It seems likelier, however, that Locke conceives of powers as relational properties. The ability of an object to cause certain sensations depends on the ways in which the insensible constituents of matter interact with our own sense organs. For an object to have power, then should involve a certain relation between the object and the perceiver. Power should have as much to do with the laws of neurophysiology as with the laws of physics. If this is the case, then secondary qualities cannot be said to exist entirely independently of all observers. There needs to be at least the potential for their being observed, such as their being on a planet with creatures capable of perceiving them in order for them to exist. Locke's analogy between sweetness and pain provides further support for this reading. In the analogy, Locke claims that sweetness is in food exactly as pain or sickness is in food. Both are powers in the food to cause certain sensations in us. If sweetness really is in food, in precisely the same way that pain is, then sweetness is certainly mind dependent. No one would claim that pain still existed in a world devoid of creatures with pain receptors. Presumably, then on Locke's picture, in a world devoid of creatures with color, sound, taste, and odor receptors, color, sound, taste, and odor would not exist. Clarifying the important distinction. Here we take one more opportunity to clarify the important distinction. In itself, the distinction is not hard to understand, but the language we use tends to blur the very distinction Locke is trying to explain, and all too often leads to misunderstandings of the point Locke is trying to make. Let us start with a quote from the text. "Whatsoever the mind perceives in itself, or is the immediate object of perception, thought, or understanding, that I call idea. And the power to produce any ideas in our mind I call quality of the object wherein that power is." The important point to remember here is that ideas and qualities are different things. Ideas are mental entities, things that exist in our minds, whereas qualities are the causal properties or powers of physical objects in virtue of which they can cause ideas to exist in our minds. That is, in virtue of which they can cause us to have certain kind of sensations. Ideas are sensation in our mind, and qualities are the properties of objects that cause us to have those sensations. Given that qualities are causal properties of objects, it would seem that any distinction between kinds of properties, such as a distinction between primary and secondary qualities, should be a difference in the kinds of properties a thing has. This is correct, but remember that Locke defines qualities as powers to produce ideas in our minds, and so that different kind of qualities in the object are going to be distinguished in terms of the different kinds of ideas they produce in our minds. The difference between primary and secondary qualities then, or at least the crucial one, is in the kind of ideas they produce in our minds. What is that difference? Locke explicitly answers that question. From what I have said, I think it's easy to draw this observation, that the ideas of primary qualities are resemblances of them, which means that the ideas are resemblances of the qualities. And the patterns do really exist in the bodies themselves, but the ideas produced in us by these secondary qualities have no resemblances to them at all, which means that the ideas do not resemble the qualities. So the difference between primary and secondary qualities can be described in terms of differences in the ideas that they produce in our minds. Qualities, in definition, are the powers objects have to produce ideas in our mind. The primary qualities of objects produce ideas in our minds that resemble the corresponding qualities in the objects that caused us to have those ideas. The secondary qualities of objects produce ideas in our minds that do not resemble the corresponding qualities in the objects that produce those ideas in our minds. Implications. Secondary qualities are reducible to, that is, can be explained in terms of the primary qualities of the particles of which the objects are ultimately composed. For example, our scientific understanding of how we come to have sensations of blue explains this in terms of the primary qualities of the tiny particles or wavelengths of light that enter our bodies. So, secondary qualities are real in the sense that objects really do have the powers to produce in us sensations of color, sound, taste, smell, touch, and temperature, but they are not ultimate in that our scientific explanations tell us that these sensations are produced in us because of the size, shape, weight, texture, and motion of tiny particles out of which everything is composed. This is what Locke is getting at when he says that the primary qualities of objects are utterly inseparable from them. What this means is that primary qualities are the ultimate qualities of the ultimate constituents of matter and not ones that themselves get explained away in terms of more fundamental qualities. Secondary qualities, by contrast, do get explained away in this fashion. They are nothing but combinations of primary qualities of ultimate particles out of which matter is composed. Criticism. Leibniz was an early critic of the distinction, writing in his 1686 Discourse on Metaphysics that it is even possible to demonstrate that the ideas of size, figure, and motions are not so distinctive as is imagined, and that they stand for something imaginary relative to our perceptions as do, although to a greater extent, the ideas of color, heat, and the other similar qualities in regard to which we may doubt whether they are actually to be found in the nature of the things outside of us. George Berkeley was a famous critic of the distinction. Berkeley maintained that the ideas created by sensations are all that people can know for sure. As a result, what is perceived as real consists only of ideas in the mind. The crux of Berkeley's argument is that once an object is stripped of all its secondary qualities, it becomes very problematic to assign any acceptable meaning to the idea that there is some object. Not that one cannot picture to themselves in their mind that some object could exist apart from any perceiver, one clearly can do this, but rather that one cannot give any content to this idea. Suppose that someone says that a particular mind-independent object, meaning an object free of all secondary qualities, exists at some particular spatio-temporal location, in Newtonian terms, in some particular place and at some particular time. Now, none of this particularly means anything if one cannot specify a place and time. In that case, it's still a purely imaginary, empty idea. This is not generally thought to be a problem because realists imagine that they can, in fact, specify a place and time for a mind-independent object. What is overlooked is that they can only specify a place and time in place and time as we experience them. Berkeley did not doubt that one can do this, but that it is objective. One has simply related ideas to experiences, the idea of an object to our experiences of space and time. In this case, there is no space and time, and therefore no objectivity. Space and time as we experience them are always piecemeal. Even when the piece of space is big, as in some astronomical photos, it's only in imagination that they are total and all-encompassing, which is how we definitely imagine real space and time as being. This is why Berkeley argued that the materialist has merely an idea of an unperceived object, because people typically do take our imagining or picturing as guaranteeing an objective reality to the existence of something. In no adequate way has it been specified nor given any acceptable meaning. As such, Berkeley comes to his conclusion that having a compelling image in the mind, one which connects to the specifiable thing external to us, does not guarantee an objective existence. Kant claimed that primary as well as secondary qualities are subjective. They are both mere appearances that are located in the mind of a knowing observer. He wrote, long before Locke's time, but assuredly since him, it has been generally assumed and granted without detriment to the actual existence of external things, that many of their predicates may be said to belong not to the things in themselves, but to their appearances, and to have no proper existence outside our representation. Heat, color, and taste, for instance, are of this kind. Now, if I go farther and for weighty reasons rank as mere appearances the remaining qualities of bodies also, which are called primary, such as extension, place, and in general space, with all that which belongs to it, impenetrability or materiality, space, etc., no one in the least can adduce the reason of its being inadmissible. Let us summarize what we have discussed so far. The distinction between primary qualities and secondary qualities was developed during the rise of modern science. In the first instance, we can think of this as a distinction between properties that science says objects have, like size, shape, motion, and properties that depend upon particular ways of perceiving objects. Color, by definition, is something that is experienced in vision. The work that scientists such as Newton, Descartes, and Galileo did on light laid the foundations for our modern theory of color as wavelengths of the electromagnetic field we experience as light. Science, therefore, was beginning to develop an explanation for color, and likewise it has developed theories of sound, smell, taste, and other secondary properties. But these theories, that color is frequency of electromagnetic radiation, that smell and taste are chemical compounds, suggest that the world as we experience it through our senses and the world as science describes it are quite different. We experience all the wonderful properties of the senses. The world as it is in itself, as described by science, is particles in motion and empty space. The distinction is most famously associated with John Locke's work, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. Now you can try to answer the questions given here. What are the central themes of primary and secondary qualities of John Locke? Discuss the theoretical dimensions of primary and secondary qualities of John Locke. What does John Locke mean by best science available? What was the criticism of Leibniz to Locke's primary and secondary qualities? Who were the scientists who laid the foundations for our modern theory of color and light? Now you can go through the reference books for further reading. John Locke by Richard Aaron, 1971. Published by the Clarendon Press, Oxford. Ideas, Qualities and Corpuscles, Locke and Boyle on the External World, by Peter Alexander, 1981, published by the Cambridge University Press, Cambridge. The Philosophy of Robert Boyle, by Peter Anstey, 2000, Routledge, London. Problems from Locke, by J. L. Mackey, 1976, by the Clarendon Press, Oxford. Reason, Truth and History, by Hilary Putnam, 1981, Cambridge University Press, Cambridge. On What There Is, in From a Logical Point of View, by W. V. Quine, 1980. Locke's Colors, by Matthew Stewart in 2003, in the Philosophical Review. Locke's Primary Qualities, by A. Robert Wilson, in 2002, from the Journal of the History of Philosophy. Thank you for watching this program. We can meet again with another topic. Have a nice day.